He looked Steve Jobs in the eye and convinced him to step aside. Not with force, not with a boardroom ambush, not even with a lie, with trust. And within 2 years, the man Steve Jobs personally recruited would help push him out of his own company. Apple didn't just lose its founder that day. It lost its identity, its direction, and very nearly, its life. We're talking about billions of dollars. A company on the edge of collapse. And a decision that, on the surface, looked completely rational. So here's the question you have to sit with. How does a company go from revolutionary genius to near bankruptcy, right after hiring the man who was supposed to save it? Back in 1983, Apple didn't look like a company that needed saving. It looked unstoppable. The Apple II was printing money. We're talking hundreds of millions in revenue at a time when most tech companies were still figuring out what they even were. Steve Jobs was 28. Charismatic. Intense. Borderline impossible to work with, but undeniably brilliant. And that was the problem. Because Apple wasn't a startup anymore. It was a public company. Investors were watching. The board was watching. And Steve wasn't built to be managed. He was impulsive, emotional, obsessed with perfection to the point of paralysis. Entire teams would get scrapped overnight because something didn't feel right. From the outside, it looked like chaos wrapped in genius. Inside Apple, it felt like a ticking clock. So the board, and eventually Steve himself, decided they needed someone else. Not a visionary, a grown-up. Someone who understood scale, structure, operations. Someone who could turn Apple from a phenomenon into a stable, predictable business. That's where John Sculley comes in. At the time, Sculley was the president of PepsiCo. Not tech, not engineering, soda. But he was a lead at one thing, marketing. He helped turn Pepsi into a serious rival to Coca-Cola. He understood consumers, branding, mass appeal, and Steve Jobs saw something in that. There's this famous line. You've probably heard it. Steve looked at Sculley and said, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or come with me and change the world?" That line worked. Sculley left Pepsi, walked into Apple as CEO, and for a moment, it looked like the perfect partnership. Vision meets execution. Chaos meets control. But here's the thing nobody really questioned at the time. Why would a consumer marketing executive be the one to lead one of the most technically complex companies in the world? And more importantly, how much power do you give someone like that when they didn't build what they're now running? At first, nothing broke. In fact, things looked better. Sculley brought structure. Meetings had agendas. Decisions had frameworks. There was a sense that Apple was finally growing up. And Steve? He stepped back. Not fully, but enough. He focused on the Macintosh. This was his obsession. His masterpiece. A computer for the rest of us. Simple, beautiful, human. And when the Macintosh launched in 1984, it wasn't just a product release. It was a moment. That Super Bowl ad cost about $900,000 to air, directed by Ridley Scott. It didn't even show the product clearly, but it made a statement. Apple wasn't just selling computers. It was positioning itself as a rebellion against the status quo. For a second, it worked. Sales came in strong. The hype was real, but then reality hit. The Macintosh was expensive, around $2,495. Adjusted for today, that's over $7,000. It was slow, limited memory, very little software support. Consumers were curious, but they weren't buying in the numbers Apple needed. And inside the company, tension started building. Steve believed the product would win eventually. Sculley saw the numbers dropping in real time. One believed in vision. The other believed in data. Now everything I just told you, that's the version people like to repeat. The clean version. The one where it's just creative genius versus corporate executive. But what was actually happening behind closed doors was a slow shift in power that Steve Jobs didn't see coming. It didn't start with betrayal. It started with alignment. Sculley and the board began leaning toward predictability, stability, profit margins. The Apple II, an older product, was still making the bulk of the company's revenue. Macintosh, it was bleeding money. So decisions started getting made. Subtle ones at first. Budgets adjusted. Marketing shifted. Internal support moved away from Mac teams and back toward proven products. And Steve felt it. He pushed harder, demanded more resources, more control. But here's where things get uncomfortable. Steve Jobs wasn't easy to defend. He clashed with teams. Publicly. Brutally. He'd walk into meetings and tear apart months of work in minutes. People weren't just disagreeing with him. They were exhausted by him. So when Sculley started presenting himself as the stable alternative, people listened. And you have to ask yourself, when someone's behavior makes them difficult to support, does that justify removing them entirely? Or does it just make the betrayal easier to sell? By 1985, things escalated. Fast. Steve wanted control over more of the company again. Sculley resisted. The board had to choose. And behind closed doors, they started leaning toward Sculley. Not because he was more visionary, but because he was safer, more predictable, more manageable. And then came the moment. Steve Jobs tried to rally support internally to push Sculley out. But it backfired. Badly. Sculley went to the board first. Framed Steve as unstable, risky, a liability. And the board believed him. Steve was stripped of power, reassigned, pushed into a role with no real authority. At 30 years old, the founder of Apple was effectively removed from his own company. No dramatic firing. No security escort. Just sidelined. Quietly. And here's the part that hits harder than people expect. Sculley didn't see himself as the villain. He thought he was saving Apple. So what you're about to hear next, it's not about one decision. It's about what happens after you remove the person who built the soul of something and replace it with someone who only understands how to manage it. After Steve Jobs left, Apple didn't collapse overnight. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, it slowly drifted. At first, revenue held up. The Apple II kept selling. New products came out. More corporate. Less daring. Margins were okay. On paper, things looked stable. But something was off. Innovation slowed. Products started feeling safe. And safe, in a market like tech, is dangerous. Sculley leaned into what he knew: marketing, pricing strategies, product segmentation. Apple released multiple versions of similar machines. Different price tiers. Slight variations. It made sense from a business perspective, but it confused customers. And internally, the company lost its edge. Because here's the truth. Apple was never built to compete on logic alone. It was built on conviction. And once that conviction was gone, everything became a calculation. So the company started making decisions that looked smart in spreadsheets, but hollow in reality. And the market felt it. By the early 1990s, Apple's market share started slipping. Microsoft rose fast. Windows became the standard. Cheaper machines. Wider compatibility. Massive developer support. Apple. It started looking isolated. Premium pricing without the same level of utility. And then the numbers got ugly. By 1996, Apple was losing around $1 billion a year. Cash reserves were shrinking fast. The company that once defined personal computing was now being openly discussed as a potential acquisition target. Or worse, irrelevant. And you have to sit with this for a second. How does a company go from leading an industry to nearly disappearing in just over a decade? Was it really just market competition? Or did it start the moment they chose control over vision? What you're about to hear now, this is the part most people don't fully process. Because it's not just about failure. It's about reversal. Apple, desperate, made a move that seemed almost unthinkable at the time. They brought Steve Jobs back, not as a hero, as a last resort. He returned in 1997 when Apple acquired Next, his new company, for about $429 million. At that point, Apple was weeks, maybe months, from running out of options. And Steve? He walked back into a company he didn't recognize. Bloated product lines. Confused strategy. No clear identity. So he did what he always did. He cut. Hard. Killed projects. Simplified the product line. Refocused everything. Within a year, Apple went from near bankruptcy to profitability. Within a few years, it launched the iMac. Then the iPod. Then eventually, the iPhone. Trillions of dollars in value. All built after the company almost died. And here's the uncomfortable question. If Steve Jobs never got pushed out, does any of that even happen? Or was the near-death experience the only thing that forced Apple to become what it is today? John Sculley never went to jail. This wasn't a crime. It was a decision. A series of them. He left Apple in 1993. No dramatic downfall. No public disgrace. Just gone. And for years, he defended his actions. Said they were necessary. Rational. Based on the information he had at the time. And maybe he believed that. But Apple paid the price. Billions lost. Years of drift. A company that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. And Steve Jobs? He came back different. Sharper. More focused. Less chaotic. Almost like the failure refined him. So who really betrayed who? Was it Sculley removing Steve? Or was it Apple choosing comfort over conviction? Because here's what sticks with you. The scariest part of this story isn't that someone made the wrong call. It's that at the time, it looked like the right one. Stable leadership. Predictable growth. Controlled risk. Everything investors say they want. And it almost killed one of the greatest companies in history. So when you look at decisions in your own life, the safe ones, the logical ones, the ones everyone agrees with, you have to ask yourself, what are you quietly giving up in exchange for stability?